I know the second day of a conference is always a little bit more of a challenge to get where we're going on time. It always is for me. I assume it is for you as well. What we plan to do with this session is examine some of the strategic implications of energy. Right? There's a great deal of talk, in the U.S. at least, about something we call the shale gas, shale oil revolution. And there's debate about what that means and how it's developed and what it means not just for U.S. energy production and consumption, but what it means for global markets and therefore global climate issues, trade, and the knock-on effect of international security. So we'll sort of examine that, and Jonathan Moyer, who's sitting next to me from the Pardee Center for International Futures, is going to help us start to examine that in a little bit. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Pardee Center, they're housed at the University of Denver. There's some reading materials out on a table out here because they will be able to explain it to you better than I can. My understanding of the Pardee Center, and Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong here, they specialize in doing strategic planning and analysis based on a quantitative backbone. When I first met Jonathan, I went into the Pardee Center, and they have this wall of large television screens and computers where they've inputted all kinds of data, and they can manipulate factors to change things in their quantitative analysis. It's really quite stunning, some of the quantitative work that they're able to do and how that has implications for how we think about strategy, right? That we're not just basing our thoughts on intuition, but rather have some kind of an empirical basis for that decision making. So I asked Jonathan to come. He agreed. I'm really glad that you're going to be here to be our first speaker. After Jonathan speaks, Dr. Habibine will take the podium as well. Currently with the Kuwaiti Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences. Correct? Did I get the name right? Yes. And formerly with OPEC. So he'll have a good sense of energy, not just the shale gas situation in the U.S., but I think a broader perspective on the whole energy mix and what all of this means. And then finally, Subha Chandran from the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies will talk about the downstream implications of energy development, things like pipelines and how these play into regional economic and political integration. So we've got a very good panel this morning to examine some fairly complicated issues. So we're each going to take about 20 minutes or so to raise some questions that you might have from the floor. And so with that, Jonathan, the floor is yours. Please join me in a warm welcome for Jonathan.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here. So far I've enjoyed my brief time in Thailand, and sadly it will remain brief. I leave again tomorrow morning. So it's been about the same amount of time traveling as it is being here, but I think it's worth it for sure. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I enjoyed the panels yesterday. The Pardee Center for International Futures is the home of a quantitative tool that's been used pretty widely around the world. It's been used by the U.S. government, by a number of governments in Europe, in Africa, and South America, international organizations, and we have a pretty wide reach, though we're not entirely widely known. So this presentation is designed to give you a sense of some of the model outputs that we can produce. We're not energy modelers per se. We're macro level integrated assessment modelers. So energy is a piece of what we do, but we're also interested in exploring things like education, health, the economy, demographics, governance, etc. I'll try not to bore you. And if you have any questions, bring them up later on. But for this presentation, Tyler asked us to explore some of the geopolitical implications to natural gas, unconventional gas production. Okay. So again, I'll say that I'm not the energy expert. I would certainly defer to the former head of OPEC for energy-related issues, but I am an integrated modeler. So let's begin. The presentation plan today is going to be fairly succinct, I hope. We're going to start by exploring 3 global forecast scenarios for energy production, one of which has no unconventional gas production, one of which has a more modest production profile, similar to what the IEA would be forecasting, and the third, which would be a more extended forecast, that would be a shale boom, which we think is possible, but on the outer edge of possibility. We're going to explore the impact of this on climate change. The full environmental impact of unconventional gas production is very difficult to quantify. There are lots of smaller contingent impacts that we're not able to capture, which we try to represent qualitatively. The third aspect of this is we're going to explore some of the feed-forward impacts on OPEC and specifically Saudi Arabia of a massive unconventional gas production scenario. The tool we're using is very integrated across countries and issue areas. So changes in the energy sector in one country impact all sectors in all countries. And these aren't just economic sectors. This is access to education, electricity, water and sanitation, health outcomes, governance capacity, corruption, etc. Fourth, we're going to then explore if a massive unconventional gas production scenario would have a significant impact on the potential transition in power between the US and China. We do a lot of measurement of national level power for the US government and other academic sources. Then, if my time isn't too long in the tooth, I'm going to explore a case study that we've done with the South African government. And then finally, God forbid I have enough time, which I doubt I will, but I'll introduce the tool. And of course afterwards, if you have any specific questions, I'd be happy to chat. So unconventional gas. What's unconventional gas? We represent it, and most people talk about it as being coal bed methane, tight gas, and shale gas. So these are 3 forms of gas that we always knew they were there, but they had always been previously uneconomical to extract. They've become much more economical in certain places to extract, largely within the United States. In the United States, there's been a large revolution in the production of shale gas in particular, though there are also there's also coal bed methane and tight gas. You can see here, this is from an IEA report that shows the conventional gas reserves for different countries and then the unconventional gas reserves. A couple things to note, you have the traditional gas powers and players out there, the Russia, the Iran, the US and Saudi Arabia. Unconventional gas has a very significant potential to increase Chinese energy independence, though there are also extensive environmental costs, and the technology right now is certainly not available. But we're trying to forecast when and the magnitude to which unconventional gas could significantly increase Chinese energy independence. So I have these 3 scenarios. The one scenario is, I basically took, so we've been doing this modeling for about 40 years. That's before me. That's my boss, and he started with the big machines with the cards. I don't remember these machines, and I've never actually seen one, but I have faith that they did exist. And I assume some people in this room has seen them. But there's a card and some punching. I don't understand exactly. But, so this model's been under development for a long time. So what I did for this no unconventional base case was I basically took our base case scenario profile from about 5 years ago. So what did we expect to happen with natural gas production 5 years ago? And that's the no unconventional scenario. Then next I used a base case unconventional, which is a fairly reasonable, though I think it's a bit more bullish than the IEA reports, which I think are a bit more conservative in the long run than they could be. And then the final scenario is a very aggressive boom scenario. So what happens if we really begin to exploit this resource very, very aggressively globally, if the technology's there, if the cost is appropriate, etc. So this is our scenario. This is global energy production. Global energy production from 1960 to 2050. So this is where we are about today. This is in billions of barrel oil equivalent. Jonathan, you want this? I can. Can you hear me if I yell?
Use the mic.
Use the mic. I'm using the mic. Got the mic. Hello. I just feel like a motivational speaker when I do this. It feels very disingenuous. But okay. So here we have oil production, coal production, gas, and this is our forecast for an integrated version of renewable energy that doesn't include hydroelectric power. Hydroelectric power and nuclear are represented down at the bottom. So this is kind of how we expected the energy production profile globally to unfold about 5 years ago. Now, I fixed the y-axis, so the vertical axis here. So the next scenario, this is a bit more of an aggressive but a plausible base case for gas production within a global energy production profile using unconventional gas. So you can see what it does is it pushes back other renewables, it reduces some of the production from coal and oil, and the red gas line significantly bumps up. The third scenario is very aggressive, right? This significantly pushes back other renewable energy production, and it continues to dampen coal and oil production. So those are the three vignettes that we'll be looking at. The first takeaway from this, the IEA report is very clear that using unconventional gas can reduce overall carbon emissions. Our modeling and our work would indicate that that's not true. When you look at it within a broader integrated perspective, using unconventional gas significantly pushes down the price of energy largely across the board. While it does substitute for dirty coal, which does reduce carbon emissions, because the price is significantly lower, it incentivizes more consumption of gas, which raises the overall carbon emission, especially when considering that it pushes back the renewable energy production transition. So here you see the top line, the green line would be our shale boom scenario, the red line would be our shale, fairly aggressive but plausible scenario, and the blue line would be what we expected for global carbon emissions previously. This, of course, has a feed-forward impact to global temperature change, and this is also something that we would integrate within our system. So you can see it's about if you're just comparing in 2050, it's about a 10% increase in average surface temperature of the Earth. So that's actually kind of significant. This whole conference is predicated on the question of are we dealing with revolutions or evolutions? And the more I thought about this, the more I thought, well, we're obviously dealing with both. If we would have a massive revolution in how our energy system is produced, we would see evolutionary changes in different aspects, like climate change, which could then lead to spillover effects that were also revolutionary. So this 20% increase in the average surface temperature could, of course, feed forward to lots of localized, contingent issues with changes in weather patterns, extreme weather events, issues around water scarcity, etc. Next, this would have a feed-forward impact on traditional producers of oil, for example. If the gas market became globalized, and that's a big assumption within this forecast, we would assume that over the next 10 to 15 years, the global gas market could be effectively globalized, and there could be a global price for natural gas. If that happened, then there would be certainly more fungibility across the different energy types, and we would expect to see a reduction, and this is in OPEC oil production. This is historic, and then this is our forecast for the three scenarios. You see the shale boom scenario, there's a much more dampened oil production trend line.
What's the unit?
Billions of barrels, BBOEs.
That's for gas production? Or
This is oil. Yeah, billion barrels of oil
Per
equivalent.
year?
Is that again?
Per year?
Yes, per year, annual, yeah. And this, of course, would have feed-forward impacts on governments within OPEC. Saudi Arabia doesn't have a huge amount of unconventional gas to produce. A lot of other players come online.
and their oil production is dampened based on this large shale boom scenario, we would see an impact on something like Saudi Arabian government revenue. The basic takeaway here is that comparing how we expected energy production to take place 5 years ago with how it could unfold based on a big shale boom, you're looking at the Saudi Arabian government losing about $1 trillion in revenue every decade, just based on this change, which would be significant. And we can quantify the impact of losing $1 trillion in revenue every decade on something like Saudi Arabian HDI. So the Human Development Index, as we all know, is made up of variables representing education, health, and income. Even in a shale boom scenario, we still expect Human Development Index within Saudi Arabia to increase significantly, but we would expect to see a dampening. This obviously has impacts on security within the kingdom, as well as spending on infrastructure, the military, etc. So there could be significant spillovers. There could be significant geopolitical implications to a large-scale gas fracking scenario. We also measure national power. I've heard in a number of conversations here, I've heard discussions of soft power versus hard power. We produce an integrated measure of power. I'm happy to talk to anyone about this afterwards, but it's a lot to get into right now. But an integrated measure of power that combines things like material capabilities with diplomatic capabilities with some aspects of institutional power as well. And so what we see here is a situation in which the Saudi Arabian power would be decreased by about 20% relative to what we would have expected 5 years ago with a massive shale boom scenario. This has implications for power distribution across the Middle East. And we could explore the implications for Iranian power distribution or any of the other countries within the region. Now, would this massive shale boom have any significant impact on the power transition between the United States and China? So this is using the same measurement of power that I briefly introduced. This is a measure of US power and Chinese power historically, so from 1960 to the present, and then as our forecast across the different shale scenarios. It really has no impact. This variable alone has no impact. And that's largely because both China and the US can benefit significantly from a shale boom scenario. And if they both benefit in absolute terms, in relative terms, it's the same, right? So there are things that do change this transition period between China and the US, but this shale boom scenario does not. So this, just to be clear, just in case these, I'm getting blank stares, I apologize. So this is arguing that the US had about 20% of the world's power historically. China had about 5%, that to the 90s started growing to 10% in about 2010, and then has continued to grow across time. Really briefly, and I don't even know where I am on time. About 15 minutes is what I think I am. If my internal clock's kind of sideways.
We're good.
Okay. We explored South African unconventional gas production. The South African energy production profile is one of the most skewed in the world. It's about 95% coal. And the coal that they produce is really some of the dirtiest coal that's out there. So we were exploring what the implication of an unconventional gas production scenario would be for the South African economy and energy sector, etc. I was very skeptical when I started this project because in the US you hear a lot about how gas fracking in particular is very environmentally destructive. And it does have significant environmental costs that we're not able to model. But we did try to do a pretty thorough job of exploring some of the environmental costs within this brief. So this is South Africa, and the colors on the map represent areas in which there are water scarcity. Okay? The blue lines, the slotted blue lines represent areas that are positioned for natural gas fracking. Okay? So you can see that there are significant overlaps between areas of high water stress and areas that would be slotted for natural gas fracking. Partially because of this, because of a lot of external pressure, South Africa put a moratorium in place on gas fracking exploration, which they recently lifted. I think it was just this January they lifted. So that's one of the challenges. How do you do fracking, which is very water intensive? How do you do fracking in areas that have high levels of water scarcity? What we did was we created a couple of scenarios. One scenario that just pursued gas fracking, and another scenario that pursued gas fracking, levied an excise tax on gas fracking that we then used to invest in renewable energy. It was a very small tax on gas fracking, and it ended up garnering a massive amount of resources to be invested in renewable energy technology. Those three scenarios, the Blue Bridge scenario at the top, I don't know if you can read it, that scenario is a scenario where we took revenues from gas fracking, which of course within the model, if you're taxing a resource like this, reduces the amount that you're able to produce, so that disincentivizes production, and we invested that in renewable technology. This was our base case. This was what we would expect to see in 2050 if there was no significant investment in gas fracking or renewable energy. And this was if we did not incentivize renewable energy. The bubble size, this is all in 2050. The bubble size is the overall level of energy production at the South African national level. The colors represent, blue is gas, because it burns blue. We're very creative. Coal is green, which makes no sense. But don't read into that color. Just read into the blue color. Nuclear is pink. Again, it doesn't make any sense. And renewable energy is orange. So you can see in this top scenario, we have overall more energy production than in a scenario where we just pursued gas fracking, or a scenario where we pursued neither gas fracking or renewable energy. And in terms of the overall mixture, coal is a smaller share of that. It's 34% down here and 27% up here. And renewable is a much larger share. It's obviously over half up here and almost 40% at the bottom. So this is an example of the kind of analyses that we're doing. And I think the takeaway is that gas fracking can be done really effectively to promote macro level environmental sustainability, moving towards renewable energy production if managed properly. Now again, I'll say that many of the smaller, more micro level impacts are not quantifiable in a macro model like this. So water scarcity will remain an issue where fracking happens. Water pollution will remain an issue where fracking happens. Micro level earthquakes will remain an issue. And of course, surface level degradation and biodiversity interruption. So all of those remain concerns. Now briefly to the tool. What we are is a macro tool that integrates more key development systems than any tool that I've ever been exposed to. So we integrate demography, and here we would follow the same logic as the UN Population Division, but we extend that logic by incorporating systems like economic systems. For anyone who's an economic modeler, it's a partial CGE model with systems dynamic characteristics. With education systems, health systems, because we need to know how human development is unfolding in order to understand how all of these systems are unfolding. Along with infrastructure, domestic governance, international political, energy. I've focused most of my talk on energy. Agriculture, technology, and the environment. So the thing that makes us unique is that these are all connected. So this is my last slide, I think. Where is it? No, it's not here. It's here. This is a systems dynamic network diagram that represents how our model is structured for one country.
Are you sure?
Am I what? Am I sure? I think so. I mean, I made it. I think it's. I might have been hallucinating. It's actually, absurdist art. Now, the point of this is to show that we represent different systems, and each bubble is a variable. So this big bubble here is population. Demographics is in some way destiny. Population, the size of population has a huge impact on all other systems. So that's what this, I guess that's purple. Colors are really bad. I woke up and I realized I only had a black belt, a brown belt, and black shoes, and I got really nervous because I'm not good with colors, and my ex-wife would have not wanted me to leave the house with that. There's a reason we're not together. Green bubbles represent the economy, right? And so you can see economic variables kind of pervade all of these other systems. These red variables up here, this is the energy system within our broader system. Just to give you an understanding of the logic, this is our education submodule. This tightly knit cluster of variables. Education systems tend to be very tightly structured, right? So you have movement from primary to secondary, survival rates, enrollment rates, graduation rates, right? So those systems tend to have much tighter structures than something like the economy, which would have variables that range from, say, FDI to productivity that's determined from road access, right? So that's just to give you a sense of where this comes from, and to let you know that at the end of the day, we have a lot of resources. I got to log in. Okay, never mind. We have a lot of resources on our website if you're interested in the assumptions that went into all of this presentation. So thank you very much for your time. Please stop by and say hello afterwards.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now, Jonathan was very modest here, but you should be aware that on the University of Denver's website, the first picture that you see is of Jonathan with Ban Ki-moon, showing him this model and this system. So they're fairly well known. They've done a lot of really good work with this. So he just gave you a sample of what they can do, but I hope it gives us something to launch off on our discussion on. And to do that, Dr. Shahabuddin will walk us through his ideas on the issue. Sir, you can use the podium or up here as you wish. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Shahabuddin.
Thank you, Tyler, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And the purpose of my talk is to give you an idea about the changing energy landscape and the geopolitical implications, in particular on the Middle East and precisely on the GCC, which are the major oil producers or oil and gas producers in the world. I think it suffices to say by starting that energy security has been at the heart of the geopolitics of energy for a long time, as we all know. In the past, the focus used to be energy security meant supply security. That's what everybody kind of, nations and regions talked about. I think over the past 20, 30 years, we have come to realize that energy security has two sides. Energy security means supply security, which cannot be assured without being assured on the same level what's going to be the demand. Because if you don't know the demand, you cannot invest, and if you don't invest, you will not have supply security. This applies to any energy source, whether it's renewable, oil or gas or what have you. The second is that we know over the last 20 years, we've seen some changes, fundamental changes in energy supply and demand. Some of them are revolutionary and some of them are revolutionary, as has been mentioned or suggested by the earlier. And some of the drivers of these are already well known. You've touched upon them. Climate change is one of the main drivers that have been driving both supply and demand changes, structural changes. And I'll come to that. But in addition, of course, basic intuitive things that what drives energy demand is population growth and economic growth. And there, usually, things are more evolutionary rather than revolutionary, as we know. We don't see revolutionary ideas in population growth or economic growth. The other factor that comes in is the issue of sustainability. And sustainability has come to mean a number of drivers. One of the most important one of them is the availability. If you don't have resources available, you cannot talk about sustainability. And that applies to fossil as well as renewable or nuclear and what have you. Second is affordability. Even if you have the resource, if you cannot produce it economically, it's basically you cannot be depending on it in a sustainable way. And of course, accessibility to everybody, or to almost everybody, is another important factor of sustainability, in addition to environmental sustainability. Now, focusing on the GCC, the economies of the GCC, or oil producers in general, as you know, depends heavily on export revenues. And they are therefore very sensitive to changes, external as well as internal, regional as well as international. Just to give a few examples, and I will touch upon this toward the end in more detail: the Arab Spring, the Iran nuclear file, the sectorial issues, the Palestine-Israel issues in the region. These are regional issues that impact on the GCC in a major way. In turn, the GCC itself, because it's a major oil and gas producer and exporter to the world, exert a number of a major influence on the global geopolitics of energy. Now, there have been 3 revolutions, or some people call them revolutions. One of them is obvious. We have seen it in the slide earlier, the exponential growth in renewable. The second is the share. Whether it is a revolution or not seems to be uncertain. There are a number of models that is testing whether it's a revolution or not. And the efficiency, which is truly a silent revolution. Nobody takes notice of it, but it has made a major impact. And it's going to make much more impact in the future about energy in general, energy landscape, and the geopolitics of energy, as I will demonstrate to you. But it's important also to note that, like any revolution, the important question to answer is that how far these revolutions will go. Will renewable replace everything, or part, significant part, or what have you? And what are the implications from my point of view on the GCC? Quickly, what we have seen changes in the landscape in terms of population growth has been slowing down. In fact, there is no population growth in OECD countries. Essentially, all of the population growth, this is a structural change over the last 20, 30 years, and will continue. By the same token, is that we have seen something interesting. OECD that does not have any population growth, but has GDP growth, albeit at a modest rate, 2 to 3%. In good times, maybe a little bit over 3%, while developing countries continue to grow at 5%, maybe some of them at 7%, 8%. The combined effect is that demand for energy, or the use of energy, has continued to increase, but mainly in developing countries. OECD countries are at a saturation level while they continue to grow. And this phenomena has come about because of the reduction in energy intensities, mainly as a result of improvement in efficiencies that we have seen over the last 20, 30 years. And you could see most countries go through a cycle, energy intensities go up for a while in the beginning of the economic boom, and then it comes down later on. And it seems that they are all converging now, or at least forecasted to converge. GDP continues to grow, energy is growing, but at a different rate. That means some decoupling has taken place. And we know the reason. And the same thing is happening in CO2. We're seeing some decoupling in CO2, mainly in OECD. But also we're seeing that level of Chinese, for example, per capita CO2 emission is beginning to level off. India is still at the beginning cycle. So these are interesting things that are basically reflected in the future. By the way, I picked up all of my slides from either IEA or Department of Energy. I picked up no slide from OPEC for one good reason. I don't want to be accused of bias. But the message is the same, whatever slide you use, because these are more or less general facts. I think basically what we're seeing, all energy forms, primary energy forms, will continue to grow, but at a different rates. Fossil fuels, in particular oil, is going to grow the least, at 1% per year. Gas is probably at twice as much as that, and maybe even 3 times as much as that, 3%, 2.5%, depending on conventional and unconventional. Renewable will have the largest growth, if I can pick this slide up. Yes, I can. And you could see renewable becoming really most of the growth in the future is going to be renewable, hydro, wind, and solar, and what have you, and gas. And coal is leveling off slight growth. And this just gives you some factors, is that the generation of renewable will grow by 3 times, and then most of that growth, 70% in non-OECD, and half of it is in China and so on. I don't want to dwell on these factors. Fossil fuels share, because the growth rate will be less, their share will be less. But they still will dominate. Something like 75 to 80% of the total supply will come from fossil fuels and so on. And the reason for oil to continue to grow is because the transportation sector will continue to be captive more or less, even though we're talking about hybrid and electric vehicles and what have you. The penetration of these things over the next 20 years will still be small, and the main reason for that is that because oil energy density is about 100 times as batteries. And if you just think about that, you really have to make an improvement, a factor of 100, before you really can electric vehicles really compete on an equal footing with oil. Climate change is going to be an important driver of some of the future scenarios for oil supply. Look at this 2 scenarios from the IEA, the new energy policy scenario and the 450 scenario. The new energy policy scenario assumes that declared policies will be implemented. This would lead to a 3.5 degrees increase in temperature, which many people, based on IPCC science, which most people accept, although there are some questions that have arisen recently, but I think most scientists dismiss these things as insignificant, and therefore the 3.6 degrees based on the new policy scenario is usually accepted. People want to go to 2 degrees, therefore this 450 scenario, 450 means 450 parts per million CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is the saturation. And you can see in order to get to that, most of it has to come from efficiency. This is the revolution, the silent revolution, that drives most of the structural changes in demand, which is equivalent as supply, or more or less. The second will be renewable biofuel, which is part of renewable going to mobility, and then you have nuclear, very little contribution, but there. And most importantly, people ignore it, carbon sequestration. Without carbon sequestration, it's going to be extremely difficult to meet those targets. And that receives the least attention so far. In fact, carbon sequestration currently is almost written off in the short to medium term. And yet, if you look at this, it looks like it's going to be essentially essential for the future. Now, I talked in the beginning about availability. And 10, 15, 20 years ago, when I was an OPEC, the talk in the town was, do we have enough oil resources? Peak oil was famous. Books were written. Millions of copies were sold. But guess what? Like most people who knew in the business at that time, they knew that there is plenty of fossil resources, oil, gas, and coal, conventional, unconventional. The problem is not just availability, but investment and technology. And we have seen what has happened. And this is just a diagram of basically the various type of resources available in thousands of barrels of oil for different type of resources. And if you are willing to pay the price, you can have as much as 7 trillion barrels of oil equivalent available in the next 20, 30, 40 years. Half of them from unconventional, 3 trillions from conventional, 3 trillions from unconventional, while proven reserves today is only conventional, is only about 1 trillion. So there's about factor of 7 with the unconventional coming in. So there's not a question, there is no issue about availability. It's about the technology, it's about economics, it's about CO2 and all of these issues. So unconventional, I'm not going to dwell on it, you talked about it before me. I think the one fact I want to say about unconventional, whether it's oil and gas, and this is from the US Geological Survey map or Department of Energy, basically, is that they are more or less more evenly distributed than conventional resources. China has lots of gas unconventional. Europe has lots of unconventional. The difference being is that the geology or basically the underground and above ground situation differs from country to country. In the US, is in a unique position where the geology is favorable and the above ground is also favorable. Well, above ground means the policies. In the US, the oil underneath the ground belongs to the person who owns the land on the surface. Therefore, the regulator job is simply, as a government, is simply to regulate production. In the rest of the world, the government owns the oil underground. Therefore, it is a regulator and a producer. And that makes it tougher in some countries and easier in other countries. Which tells us what's going to happen is going to be very uncertain. Look at these different projections, both on the left-hand side for tight oil forecast could range up from about under 6 million barrels to over 10 million barrels a day in terms of increment. And on the right-hand side is the uncertainty in the gas. So the key point about this revolution is a huge uncertainty over the next 10, 20 years. And I explained some of the reasons. I don't need to dwell on them. We could take them up in the Q&A. I'm just trying to make sure I have, how many minutes left I have? Okay. Basically, this is a summary of the supply and demand picture. If you look on the left-hand side, you see most of the growth in the supply and the demand is going to come from China, India, and the Middle East, with few other countries. And surprisingly, on the supply side, most of the growth is going to come from where? North America and the Middle East, OPEC. In the short to medium term, it's going to be focused on North America, on conventional oil, Canada, tar sands, and what have you. But ultimately, the OPEC countries will prevail because they have 3/4 of the proven reserves of conventional oil. But that means that the trade patterns are going to change. And this is just from the International Energy Agency that goes to demonstrate. You could see how in North America, 2012, 2015, net imports have dropped down dramatically. And essentially nothing is going to come from the Middle East. And Europe is going to depend a lot, mostly on Africa and Russia rather than the Middle East, while Asia is going to depend almost exclusively to meet its rising demand from the Middle East. And that means there can be a shift in the dependence, import dependence in countries. The United States is currently heavily import dependent on oil and somewhat dependent on gas import. It's going to be net exporter of gas and almost, not quite, independent on oil and so on. So these are basically the patterns. You could see Brazil moving from net gas and oil importer almost to a net gas and oil exporter. And you could see the shifts coming in here. Some of the shifts in Europe, for example, going to worse, in North America, improving the situation. So it depends where you live and in which region. Let me skip this slide. I don't want to dwell on it for the time being. I did not talk about nuclear. Is there a future for nuclear post-Fukushima? Well, certainly what we know is that the previous forecast for nuclear has been scaled down a lot. And you could see the IEA low and high projections. You could see these projections for 2020 and projections for 2030 at different years have really come down after Fukushima. So that's the only thing I will say about nuclear for the time being, except on the GCC. What about the GCC in the remaining few moments? What does this mean for all of them? As I said earlier, they are heavily dependent on export revenues. You can see all of them above 80% reliance in terms of revenues versus government revenue. The oil represents more than 80% of the government revenues. And the same thing, the export, more than 80% of the export, and so on. The issues in the GCC countries has been, in addition to dependence on oil, is that the states have been following what's called social welfare paternalism in almost every aspect of life. And that meant that government expenditure continues to go up as the price of oil goes up, expenditure goes up, and this translates in what's called the fiscal price of oil, which means what is the price of oil needed in order to balance the budget. And today is over $80, $90 for most of the countries, and have continued to rise from about $30, $40 just less than 10 years ago. And therefore, this represents the major challenge for these countries. Without significant changes in the current policies, they're going to have some major problems. And the consequence of escalating fiscal price is not limited only to the GCC countries, but it will go around to destroy demand outside, and that comes back to haunt the GCC countries in reduced revenues. Because it accelerates efficiency of use, it prompts reduction of domestic fuel subsidies, and an other producer encourages other producers. As the higher price goes up, other technologies comes into the picture, like shale oil would not have been feasible 10 years ago when the price of oil was $30 or $25, but the price of oil now is over 80. Almost every project currently in shale oil in the United States is profitable, and so on. So when you combine these with recovery of supply coming from Libya and Iraq and Iran after the sanctions are removed, and from non-OPEC countries like Brazil, and unconventional, and the reduction in demand that we have already seen because of the efficiency revolution, this means reductions in their revenues, and they have to do something about it because they cannot maintain that by just simply adjusting the quotas in OPEC. You could do that up to a point when you're quasi-equilibrium, but when you have 3 revolutions going on, you really are hard-pressed in order to make that. Let me skip that. What is the problem domestically? We have, because of the subsidies, heavy subsidies, essentially electricity in most countries is subsidized at 90%, gasoline prices somewhere between 50 and 80%. Paradoxically, we have a shortage now of energy. We have a shortage because we don't have gas. The only country in the GCC that has free gas is Qatar. The rest have associated gas. Associated gas cannot be increased at will production. It's tied to oil. You cannot adjust the oil production at will because you need to sell it to somebody. So you could see, for example, Kuwait and UAE are already above 100% gas use. That means they have to import gas. We do import gas in the summer in Kuwait to run the power plants. Saudi Arabia is about to do that. You can see Saudi Arabia is almost at 100%, and so on. If you burn oil, because the associated gas is charged at $1 or $2 per million BTU because it's not for export, you cannot export it. If you burn oil in your power plants, you have to assume they're about $100 per barrel. You're going to lose revenues, and this is the dilemma. Many of these countries, their export in 20 years may dwindle to nothing. Saudi Arabia, in a business as usual. That means they have to change their pattern of behavior, they have to remove subsidies, and they have to think about alternative sources of energy. What are the alternatives available to them? Oil is not really an alternative for the power sector, it's an alternative for the transportation sector. But for the power sector, the alternative is renewable, in particular solar. And you have 1 minute? Okay, I'll wrap up. So basically, the alternatives is renewable and nuclear. Why nuclear? Because at $100, instead of burning oil at $100, nuclear is competitive at about $60. This is all economic. And that's the reason Saudi Arabia, for example, is thinking about building 17 gigawatts of electricity. Of course, there are other considerations for going nuclear, which we are talking about here, which is the regional nuclear programs that have non-civilian implications. These are some targets for renewable in GCC and in nuclear in GCC. I think the nuclear, the two ones important are UAE and Saudi Arabia, in addition to Iran. All of the others have canceled their programs after Fukushima. But there is a very aggressive renewable programs going on almost in every country. Saudi Arabia is talking about 50 gigawatts of renewable between solar, wind, and what have you. Since I have taken much of my time, I will stop here, and I can take up the rest of them in some questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. These slides are very detailed. There's a lot on here that perhaps you can't see from your seat, especially if you're sitting in the back. So what I'm going to do is ask our speakers, if they're willing, if you would like to see some of their slides, ask them for the slides, and we can help distribute what needs to be distributed if you're interested in following up. So I'll turn now to Suba. You can go ahead and take the floor, and please join me in welcoming Suba.
Thank you, Tyler. Mine is just a one-slide presentation, more on the politics of it than on the numbers and the graphs. Especially after that first presentation by Jonathan, I see only numbers all around. For example, Tyler, you look like number 7 to me. So many numbers around. And second, I'm also not a number person. So I focus more on the politics side of it. Primarily looking at what's happening in Central Asia and South Asia. My initial intervention is a question based on what's happening in terms of the gas pipelines and the electricity corridor. Whether they will do to CASA, Central Asia, South Asia region, what coal and steel did to Europe. I'm sure all of you are aware of what happened in how European Union integration started with coal and steel and then how they have come all the way here. I'm sure you're also aware that South Asia and Central Asia are perhaps the least integrated region economically. There's not much of an interaction between the two regions as well. So the question that we are trying to, at least I'm trying to find out, is whether these two, the pipelines and the gas and the electricity, would revolutionize CASA region as coal. And this is the question that I raised last year, and now it's not a question I'm pretty confident that it would revolutionize. There are, since we are talking about evolution and revolution, I'm just making 5 issues or 5 pipelines and the electricity corridor, looking into what is happening now, especially this year and the last year, trying to find out whether 2013 and 14 are likely to be the tipping point for the pipelines and the electricity grid that we are planning. Looking also into a kind of a SWOT analysis, what are the major roadblocks and threats in materializing this into reality, and then looking also as a kind of a third part of my presentation on what are the opportunities that would kind of undermine the threats or the roadblocks, and finally the conclusion on how we could actually revolutionize the 5 evolutions. The first one, I'll just go briefly on what's happening in the last 2 years. TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. It's one of the oldest in the region, linking Central Asia and South Asia. Many of us were extremely cynical, including myself once upon a time, that this is a pipe dream, not a pipeline. It's not going to materialize. We have been writing. I'm sure if you Google TAPI in the book, you will hit a lot of. It's not a pipeline. It's a pipe dream, kind of linking both TAPI and IPI. IPI is Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline. But on TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, if you look into what happened last year and what's likely to happen this year, just the number of meetings at the highest level, the ministerial meetings, at least 3 meetings in 2013, including one on Ashgabat, where the ministers have signed a kind of an understanding. It's an agreement on the sale of gas, which is a substantial agreement, and more importantly, that one of the primary problem for TAPI all these years have been known as wanting to fund that. Now, Asian Development Bank last year, late last year, kind of agreed to be the transaction advisor. So it's seen as a major boost, both for the project and also for potential funder who is willing to lay the pipelines. I think the TAPI forum in the Middle East is kind of convinced now that they will be able to materialize this project. There was also an issue, especially in terms of who is going to take this project. I heard some of the officials in ADB telling that there's an understanding between Chevron and Turkmenistan. Initially, it was about the onshore-offshore drilling rights. The oil giant which wants to push the gas also wants some rights in drilling. That's where the money is. Kind of there is an understanding. That's what I was told. Though there is no black and white record to prove that that the understanding between the oil giant which is going to do that and the government in Turkmenistan. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the first evolution TAPI, when compared to what happened in the 90s and the last decade, what's happening in the last 2 years is a drastic forward push. And if it goes in the same pace, I'm convinced 2013-14 would really be a tipping point for TAPI. Now, the second one is relatively a recent one, maybe the last 6 or 7 years, CASA. Central Asia, South Asia 1000, CASA 1000 is a electricity network linking Central Asia with South Asia, though it says South Asia, it's primarily Afghanistan and Pakistan, with Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. It's a process. It started sometime in 2005-6, and it got strengthened in sometime in 2007. And this year in particular, last year in particular, there were the initial reports about the design and multiple related issues have been submitted. And only a week before in Washington, the ministers of these 4 countries or 5 countries signed an agreement on the sale and purchase agreement, I think on 19th of February. So the CASA 1000, though it's not a huge mega project, but politically, once this comes, then I think multiple other things would come. That's my conviction. CASA-RAM is a kind of an extension of CASA 1000. CASA-RAM is Central Asia, South Asia regional electricity market. It envisions a market where the demand is, where the supply is. And if you look at some of the reports, independent reports and those being supported by the ADB and the World Bank reports on the project, has multiple positive things to offer. TUTAP is also part of this. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the network. Basically again on electricity. It's more of an acronym for the work that's taking place. Actually, CASA 1000, CASA-RAM is much more serious. The last one is IPI, Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline, which was kind of under pressure for a long time. India was the one which was very keen in the initial years and going extremely slow in the last few years. I'll come to it why it's going slow or why it has gone slow in the next section. Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline. Of all the 4, perhaps this is a slow evolution or kind of a blocked evolution or a checkered evolution, I could say. But the other 2, TAPI and CASA 1000, are moving, are being fast tracked, especially in the last 2 years. Now let's move into the second section, what I want to discuss. Okay, if this is what's happening, what could spoil it? What are the spoilers or the roadblocks? I consider there are certain internal, bilateral and extra-regional spoilers that would go. Bilateral in particular, that perhaps this is one region, Central Asia and South Asia together, where you have multiple bilateral conflicts and misunderstandings. We could go one by one. In a nutshell, to start with Pakistan and Afghanistan, we are all aware the problem between these 2 countries. Though the trade and transit agreement is one forward movement, there are multiple issues between these 2 countries is likely to put a question mark. But surprisingly, both on CASA and TAPI, they seem to be on the same page on these 2 projects. So Pakistan and Afghanistan is one major bilateral issue. There are few bilateral issues which is generally not known within Central Asia in terms of, especially if they're going to sell electricity, the sharing of rivers and building dams and electricity, production of hydropower. There are at least between Kyrgyzstan and Kyrgyzstan has few boundary problems with other countries. So it would be an issue, but it's not going to be a major issue for me, at least from our perspective for this project. Iran and Pakistan, in the last, though there were multiple positive developments in the last few years, the last 2 years, 2012, 13, and this year, the Iran-Pakistan relations is kind of being checkered. The sectarian issue and the violence in Balochistan province and the multiple problems that Iran has vis-a-vis Pakistan. It's one of the border-related issues, but the bigger problem would come between Iran and Pakistan on how Pakistan-Saudi Arabia relations shape up in the next few years. If you look at the last 2 months, the multiple developments, political developments between these 2 countries, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, perhaps Iran may get a bit apprehensive or, politically speaking, be worried where this relationship is heading towards. Look at the high-level meetings and the agreements signed between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia in the last 2 weeks or last 2 months. If we take a larger plan, and then India-Pakistan relations in South Asia, which has been a highly negative factor for both the pipeline project, TAPI and EP. you can talk about ours on the Indo-Pak problem, but okay, on these issues in particular. But these are some of the bilateral problems that if the evolutions have to become revolution that need to be addressed. And there are certain extra-regional actors. I'll pick up US and China in particular. US single-handedly, I'm sorry to say that, single-handedly trapped the EP pipeline project. It pressurized India to withdraw from the project, and the Indo-US nuclear deal was at a very advanced stage when the EP was being discussed, and India kind of had to bow down to the pressure from the Americans and kind of said no. And of course, it gave multiple reasons. Obviously, the security situation in Balochistan, security situation in Pakistan. But personally, I think it's the American pressure that even now between after India started going slow on EP became IP, Iran, Pakistan pipeline. Now I think even the IP has become just E or IP. That the Iran-Pakistan pipeline is also under tremendous pressure from two quarters. One is from the US pressure. Second, some of the American companies that have already invested in Balochistan, for example, in Sui, I was told that they are kind of blackmailing the government. If you go ahead with the pipeline, we would be withdrawing. I don't know how far that's true, but the extra regional pressure on South Asia, especially on Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline is a factor that we need to address. And the Chinese factor, especially when it comes to TAPI, we had a meeting sometime, I think NISA supported that project in Shanghai last year, late last year. The understanding that I have is the Chinese are not too keen on the TAPI pipeline. The reason being, that's what I could understand, because they are heavily invested in Central Asia. They don't want any diversion, given how much that gas could be produced and diverted. So they seem to be a kind of apprehension from the Chinese side. So these are the extra regional factors, and then there are certain internal factors, especially the security factor. How secure would Afghanistan be? And from an Indian perspective, the bigger question is how secure would Pakistan be? So we are talking about bringing the TAPI from Turkmenistan to India via two insecure or a problem regions. But we had a meeting sometime last year in December in Kabul. It was supported by the foreign ministry in Kabul. For some reason, they are quite confident that the pipelines. The conference was on energy futures of the region. Afghanistan seemed to be pretty confident about getting the pipelines through, and gas should not be an issue. And to an extent, I also believe personally that the security issue is a kind of an exaggerated one. If you look at, except for blowing few pipelines here and there in Balochistan, there has not been much of a damage done. But politically, we have used it, or we have securitized those. So I don't see security issue a major issue, especially if Pakistan and Afghanistan are confident that they'll be able to send gas and electricity through this. And this we have to rely upon the guarantee and the assurance that both the governments give us, rather than our own biased perspective of, or maybe we are trying to use it for a political reason, for not doing what we would like to do. So these are on the roadblocks or the threat side. The third part of my remark is on what are the opportunities, how to revolutionize these 3 or 4 evolutions. One, I'll just mention 3 or 4 opportunities. One, I did talk about US as a kind of in the previous part, but the Silk Road, New Silk Road initiative, and the effort to stabilize Afghanistan. I think CASA 1000 is in fact the agreement was signed in Washington. I think the US is pushing TAPI and US is pushing CASA. So US is one great positive factor when it comes to these 2 projects, CASA 1000 and TAPI. And my conviction is, I think this pressure would continue, and as a part of their New Silk Road initiative, I sincerely wish they took the New Silk Road initiative much more seriously than they have done so far. Of course, there is a bit of politics behind it, and from South Asia also we are seeing but keeping those politics aside, this is one initiative. Personally, I'm convinced that could integrate both the regions, especially on pipelines and electricity. So that's one positive side. The second is, all these years we have been talking about what we want to do, especially Afghanistan, Pakistan and US and Turkmenistan. Now the major positive story that I hear is based on the meeting that we had in Kabul last year. What Afghanistan wants to do, they want to, as a part of Afghanistan as a bridge between Central Asia and South Asia, the political capital, political investment that they are willing to make in these projects is quite a positive one for me, and I see it as an opportunity. The third major opportunity for this type of project is the demand. The demand in South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan and India in particular, if we have to sustain the economic growth at an 8 to 9% level in India and whatever percentage that Pakistan wants to, gas and electricity is going to be a major aspect, and neither India nor Pakistan have enough internal production, neither gas nor oil nor nuclear energy. Despite all those stories about nuclear energy, it's still in single percentage. So the self-sufficiency, I don't see it coming to South Asia. So it will have to be dependent on external sources. So TAPI and CASA 1000 will be one great source. So the need to sustain the economic growth would kind of pressurize these countries to work together on these issues. And also the growing population. I was glad to know about what's happening in Middle East, but on the other side in South Asia, the growing population, especially the youth bulge, you need to give employment to the youth bulge, which is 60% of 22 people aging between 20 and 40, around constituting 60% of our population. Huge youth bulge. And we have to provide employment. So this economic growth is a necessity for these countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And this would be a great opportunity, especially when you are looking for energy support from Central Asia. The next 2 points is what's happening within South Asia, especially I think after the elections in India. There will be kind of a positive movement taking place. One is between India and Nepal. When we talk about Central Asia and South Asia, one thing that we don't normally focus is on the hydel potential of Nepal. Nishal is here with us, maybe he'll be able to tell us. They consider that they are the second largest naturally gifted country in the world, with so much of hydel potential. But what they are making is close to zero. An issue where that could be politically, if handled well, if India and Nepal can work together on these issues, then this CASARAM that we talked about would be a logical extension. CASARAM, we are talking about only Central Asia, Afghanistan and Pakistan. If Nepal is able to produce that kind of electricity with Indian support or without it, there will be so much of a surplus in Nepal, then this could become a large grid. This is what I very well remember General Munir talking about in one of our earlier discussion in South Asia. Yesterday, Tiger was mentioning about the consortium of South Asian think tanks that we have in South Asia. In 2012, we had a focused discussion. The leading think tanks of South Asia came together and discussed on energy and environment cooperation. One of the major recommendations that came out, it was General Munir's input on this, about this energy market for South Asia. CASARAM that's being discussed here actually extends this energy market of South Asia to this side. And in the last few years, especially this year and last year, there is also a discussion of Kolkata being linked with UNMIN. And India-Bangladesh relationship, especially after the elections now being settled in Bangladesh, hopefully moving on a positive direction. Then we are talking about a huge corridor from Central Asia all the way to Southeast Asia. So linking 3 regions, and there is always this discussion about India, Bangladesh, Myanmar gas projects. So there are multiple dots that could be linked. And then I see these multiple dots as a kind of a opportunity. And as I told in my initial remark, I think this year, maybe along with last year, 2013 and 2014, could very well be a tipping point and move towards an energy and electricity revolution in South Asia and Central Asia. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Okay. Well, so far far, the discussion has ranged widely. Got that? Please go ahead. Come up to the mic. The discussion has ranged widely, which is the nature of any discussion of energy, right? It's a global. These are global commodities, global issues. So we're going to have, in order to address them, we'll have global discussions. Same rules as before. If you have a question, please just come to one of the mics, and I will move in order. So if you have a question, just go to a microphone right now. Don't worry about raising your hand. Just line up at the microphone. So I see my good friend Gaudet back.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia will have $1 trillion deficit or program. Saudi Arabia and other GCC states is diversifying its energy mix and also reducing consumption. Briefly, 3 questions for Dr. Shahabuddin. One, about Arab Spring. Does it complicate? You mentioned subsidies, and with Arab Spring, oil-producing countries have to spend more public spending, not only domestically, but also in the region. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait are giving Egypt billions of dollars. Thank not for Egypt, but it is hard for Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries. If you can say a few words about Arab Spring and subsidies. Another question about Russia. We have some Russian participants. As far as I know, under President Putin, Russia is becoming more dependent on oil and gas revenues. With prices going down, will this affect Russia? The third and most important question, there is big debate in Washington about how oil, shale gas and oil boom will affect U.S. policy with GCC states. As far as I know, think tanks in Washington debate this issue. Would love to hear from you, from the region. How do you see shale gas, shale revolution in the U.S. affecting U.S. policy in the region? Thank you.
Okay.
Just because it'll be easier for me to respond.
It'll be easier. Thanks for the question. The first question was gas replacing oil. Yeah, it would require a globalization of the natural gas market, and natural gas can be used in transportation, but it's very unlikely that it would be. More likely that it could be used to produce more electricity, which could then be used in transportation. So there's certainly a requirement of a transition in the way that liquefied natural gas works globally for gas to have such a significant boom. Your second question about whether the boom in the U.S. would be short-term, I would point you to the first graph, if this computer ever starts. The U.S. reserves in terms of gas, unconventional gas, are massive. So for it to be a short-term boom, that would, I think that's fairly implausible. And I don't know in the IEA where it says that the U.S. would be a short-term boom, but there are massive reserves. In terms of Saudi Arabia and the deficit, I didn't say that Saudi Arabia would run a deficit. I said that Saudi Arabia would have $1 trillion fewer per decade relative to what we expected 5 years ago. So Saudi Arabian revenue will continue to grow, but it will just be less than if there's a massive shale boom relative to not. So whether it's a deficit or not, I doubt. Saudi Arabia will continue to have massive revenues. They'll just be smaller than they would have been. Sir.
Yeah, this.
Okay. On the Arab Spring and the GCC countries, you are right. I mean, I went through it quickly. I said it in the beginning, I said it at the end. The Arab Spring is causing the GCC countries to increase social spending within their borders. And they have adopted very ambitious development plans in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, construction, building hospitals and educational universities, what have you. And at the same time, they are trying to make sure to shore up what they think is the governments that would be supporting their policies, like Egypt. But you see here, not all of the GCC countries are on the same wavelength, like Qatar would be on the opposite wavelength. So Saudi Arabia and Qatar are on the same wavelength in terms of Syria, but they are supporting the opposition rather than the government. The bottom line is that it is, as I said quickly, putting the fiscal price of oil at a severe pressure. It could go over $100 when the marginal cost of oil may be coming down as a result of the shale oil and the additional supplies. Maybe marginal cost of oil, which really dictates what's the price of spot prices of oil, is about $80. OPEC has a very limited room to maneuver around the marginal cost of oil. You cannot do much. You could do about 10% price influence. So that's the answer. The second question had to do about whether the North American shale, is it transit or not. I think what was meant is that in terms of oil, most people forecast the shale oil coming from the United States to be of about 10 or 20 years. Not the gas. The gas, Jonathan, you're right. The gas is huge. But both gas and oil shale has a problem in the long term, whether it is sustainable environmentally. And that is a big question mark. Not the availability, not the economic, but the environmental sustainability. But will it influence the geopolitics of the region? As I showed, and everybody knows this fact, imports dependence is going to increase in Asia, and most of that is going to come from the Middle East. Import dependence in the United States is essentially evaporating. The question is that will the US give up on the Middle East? And the answer, short answer, is no. They will not give up on the Middle East, because the United States, when it formulates its geopolitical interest, it does not look at only its own selfish interest in a particular region. It looks at its global interest. And the US is interested in China and in Europe. Chinese economic growth is very important to the United States economic growth. We know that. Now, China, yesterday was said, is that for the time being, the Chinese policy is not to get involved deeply in the security issues of the Gulf, because it's happy to see the United States continue to play that role. What I would expect is the US would kind of tone down a degree or two its involvement in the security of the Gulf, but it will not give it up. And so it's a question of how much this would create a scare within the GCC countries, remain to be seen. But certainly we are concerned, but I don't think it is sort of panic, because we do see the United States continue to influence hegemony over the region because of its interest in Europe also. If the Middle East problems exasperate and the Arab Spring moves into the GCC, Europe will be in trouble, as well as China and the United States. Therefore, United States exercising its global leadership will compel it to continue to play a role in the region. And I forgot the third question, but never mind, we don't have time.
Okay. First, thanks all for your great presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I have 4 questions. I will try to put it short. The first question is especially to Jonathan. You showed in one of your slides the kind of prediction of Chinese unconventional oil or gas production. And you said somehow like say 10% growth rate per year. I think it is somehow too optimistic because based on today's assessment, well, the unconventional gas or oil in China, it just makes say 1% of all whole say volume. So the question to you is that where is your base of the data? And the second and the third question, say, go to the first two presenters. The first one is that, well, it's quite clear that exploration of unconventional energy has a huge negative impact on environment. And I think, well, does it make sense to create kind of global institution with which we can monitor or regulate this issue, or shall we leave it just to national governments, where some governments cannot, say, control this kind of wide capitalist practice? This is the second question. The third question, do you think, the third question also to the first two presenters, do you think that the exploration of unconventional energy will slow down greatly the pace of, say, production of renewable energy? Well, in reality, only the renewable energy is the really sustainable one. Finally, a special question to, say, Adnan, since you are in the Gulf region. Well, what's your prediction about Israelis' exploration or production of unconventional, say, energy in terms of shale gas? Will it have kind of a political implication in the sense to change the landscape of the geopolitics there? Thank you.
Jonathan, you want to?
To the aggressive Chinese growth, the reason I'm up here, right here, is because we want to show slides that would answer these questions, because I see just numbers, and 7, 8, 9, right? And the Chinese growth that we have in the model doesn't take place for about 10 to 12 years. So we don't see any significant growth in Chinese gas, unconventional, for about a decade. So we're very slow, and then it starts to take off considerably. Oh wow, it started. Do you want to respond to his other questions while I pull up a graph real quick? If you don't mind, sir.
No problem. Let me start from the last question, since it was addressed specifically to me on the potential Israeli production of unconventional gas. It certainly will have an impact. I mean, imagine that Israel, as part of the Camp David peace treaty with Egypt, was importing cheap gas from Egypt, and now suddenly it finds itself in a position where it may be exporting gas to the region and maybe to Europe. So economically and security-wise, it's going to change the equation vis-a-vis the relationship of Israel to its neighbor and the peace treaties that exist, and the potential peace treaties between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think if it does anything, it's going to strengthen the hand of the Israeli negotiators. That's the bottom line answer. There may be some pluses and negatives here, but the net effect would be to strengthen the hand of the Israeli negotiator. While I have it, two quick feedback on the other two questions, which I assume they were addressed to me since you said it's the first two presenter. Unconventional gas definitely has an impact on the environment. Should we have a global monetary institution? I think we have too many global institutions. What we can do is that maybe assign that responsibility to one of the existing global institutions. And is it going to have an impact on renewables? Well, I think at the bottom line is going to be the economic. I think let's remember that renewables are in an exponential growth for one reason, because we are seeing the low-lying fruit, the wind farms that are cheap, the solar rooftops that are cheap, the CSPs that are cheap. But once these are taken off the map, the remaining projects will be expensive, because you have to overcome intermittency and storage. Right now, it's very competitive, even in the Gulf, to put solar panels during peak hour. It's cheaper than burning oil, but the sun shines only for a few hours. So at night, you cannot do that. So you have to do storage, and then it becomes very expensive. Look what happened in Europe after Fukushima. Europe phased out the nuclear, but Germany, which is the most environmentally champion, is basically burning coal because it's cheaper. Coal is cheaper because unconventional gas in the United States is substituting coal. So coal now is being shipped to Germany to replace nuclear, and so on. So the bottom line is economics what really matters.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. These are our three scenarios for Chinese gas, and so you can see this kind of are more plausible. You don't see significant growth for about a decade. And then if we would add the U.S. to this, just to give you a perspective. So those are the same three scenarios based on reserves, resource price, technology for the United States. So the U.S. has much faster and earlier growth in China in gas. So it's not just growing right away. Then the other question about renewable, I'll just show you this is our global renewable forecast for the three scenarios. So the massive shale boom, this exponential growth that keeps getting referred to, is taking place. So a massive shale boom would push back this growth, but not by that much, by 5 to 10 years. So it would have an impact. And in terms of the global monitoring organization, we can't get an organization to get its act together on climate change. I doubt that we would be able to get one that could work effectively to mitigate the environmental costs of carbon, of unconventional gas.
Sir, please, and this will have to be our last question for the session because I'm a human rights lawyer at heart, and your human right to coffee and cigarettes is going to take precedent over your right to ask more questions. So, sir, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Khalid Iqbal from Islamabad Policy Research Institute, Pakistan. First, I have a direct question to Jonathan. You have talked about the exploration of shale gas, and I suppose it requires a lot of water resource to be pumped in at high pressure. May I ask that what is going to be the impact on the overall availability, because the global community is also hit by the water scarcity on one hand, and then what this pressurized input and output of the water and the gas is going to have subsequent effect on the texture of the land mass in that area. And then I'll come, if you may like to answer this question, then I can move over to part 2 of my question.
Okay, sure. Water scarcity, when we model the amount of water that you would use to do hydraulic fracking on a massive scale, this gets to the question of revolution versus evolution. If you look at it, and it's a levels of analysis question, if you look at it at a national level, it's maybe 1/10 of 1% of national water usage. But when you move down to local levels, then you really begin to see water scarcity becoming a major issue. And in terms of the water pressure leading to environmental impacts, there's a direct link between shale fracking in particular and what are called micro-earthquakes. These are earthquakes that happen in areas that don't typically have tectonic plates rubbing against each other. They're small, localized, and they can cause infrastructure damage as well.
Second, I'll move to the affordability part of the energy, and I think there were 2 components which were, if those would have been covered in more details, that would have given us better understanding of the energy in the overall perspective. One is the hydel generation and the projected impact it's going to have over the next 20 to 30 years, whether it's going to increase or decrease. And the second one is the affordability of the electricity in countries like India and Pakistan. We are not hit as much by the availability of the power as we are hit by the affordability factor of it. India and Pakistan share the distinction that we have one of the lowest per capita power generation available, 48 and 49 kilowatt hours per capita. And this connection, we are looking for cheaper resources of power generation. Once we zero out to the resources, they are the hydro resources are the first, followed by the coal, followed by gas, provided there is enough of domestic production, which none of us has at the time, for the time being. And the imported gas, if we are going to link the prices to 70% of the crude or so the water volatility we have in the oil prices is going to be transferred into the power generation sector of South Asian countries. Then third one is the nuclear, then coal, and then we move on towards other resources. So, for example, I'll quote an example from Pakistan, that there we have power generation capacity as of now is much more than the power peak power demand during summers when all the air conditioners and the cooling appliances are running, and the peak demand in the winter when all heating devices are running. So the problem is that the electricity generation through thermal resources is too expensive to afford in Pakistan and India and other South Asian countries, and we are looking forward for a cheaper solution, and those are coal. If you go over to the coal, Pakistan can. India is already producing about 40% of its power through coal, but then the impact is on the environmental side of it. The next one is the nuclear portion of it. I think India made a landmark decision to go for agreement 1, 2, 3, and Pakistan also is struggling hard to have the nuclear power. The reason is that the power, if the nuclear power plants is more than 1,000 megawatts capacity or more than the levelized cost drops down to 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt, and as compared with the thermal power generation cost, which is about 19 to 20 cents. So these are the cost of one of the factors which is going to impact the overall energy profile at the global level in the years to come, not as much as the availability of the energy. It's the affordability which is hitting the developing countries more, because if they cannot afford the electricity, the domestic consumer cannot buy it, and we have power outages as we have in Pakistan. We have the power, but the consumer can't afford it. Likewise, our industries will tend to become non-competitive if we do not get down to cheaper resources of power. So I think, and second point, and just a comment on Mr. Chandra's perception about the pipelines passing through Pakistan. Pakistan is fully committed to TAPI as well as IPI, and I think there is no problem from Pakistan. There are no problems between Pakistan and Afghanistan also. Both countries have an agreement to let these energy corridors, energy pipelines pass through. The problem is coming from the extra-regional sides. It's in kind of pressures, it's in kind of sanctions of Iran, which is complicating the problem. Hopefully once the sanctions go by, maybe the project takes off. About Saudi Arabia's pressure, I don't think so there is pressure from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have very special brotherly and relationship where we understand each other's sensitivities. If Saudi Arabia is going to, it may be a small irritant, but let me assure you it's not a showstopper. The main obstacle are the sanctions, and we hope that the new program between Iran and the United States, and hopefully if the nuclear deal and things work out, probably the environment may improve. So therefore, my point is that the affordability is the major cost that must be examined towards our projected global energy parameters and profiles for the future. Thank you.
Okay. So would anybody like to address the affordability issue? Okay.
Yeah, I think you are right. I quite agree with your prescription for Pakistan and Indian subcontinent power choices. The only thing you probably missed is that you really have to explore renewable to support nuclear. I think there is a room for renewable that needs to. There is room for renewable to support your power needs. The second quick comment I have is on affordability. Unfortunately, gas prices are not as global as oil prices. Therefore, the marginal cost of gas is not uniform. If the U.S. will export gas at $4, then you have to add to it $4 to $6 to get it to Asia, and that becomes $10 or above that. And that's quite different in the case of oil, because the shipping cost in oil is much smaller percentage. So that is going to be your disadvantage in the power sector. and the marginal cost probably in the region, Indian subcontinent, for gas will continue to be above $10, most people predict.
Just 2 points. One on the point that you made on production. I think more than the production, the primary issue in India and Pakistan is the distribution. The T&D losses, transmission and distribution losses in South Asia is perhaps one of the highest in the world. We are great thieves of electricity. No, it happens all the time in this part of the world. So these T&D losses, more than the production, it's the distribution that's a major issue for us in India and Pakistan. Equally important is the strength of our institutions that work on electricity. You know, WAPDA in Pakistan and some of the other institutions all over South Asia is one of they are known for their weakness. They are one of the most corrupt institutions. If you have to go by the Transparency International report, how corrupt is our energy sector, you would come up with a totally different. So production and availability is only one part of the story for lack of gas and electricity in India, Pakistan, and South Asia. The T&D losses and the strength of the institutions. We take 23 years, 25 years to finish a small project, small island project. And then I think we are much behind in terms of the technology in transmitting from point A to point B. The last point, sir, is on. I'm glad to know that there is not much of a problem between Pakistan and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran. If that is the case, then why did Iran, Pakistan? Fair enough, India didn't become a part of it, so Iran-Pakistan pipeline didn't come in. What is the problem with Iran-Pakistan pipeline? Why did Iran-Pakistan pipeline did not come to Pakistan? You know that there are multiple other issues, from funding to external pressure to multiple other issues. Let's not go into it. The last point on nuclear energy, I'm not too hopeful about nuclear energy and how much it would contribute to the entire energy sector in South Asia, especially India and Pakistan. You seem to be much more hopeful about the 123 agreement than us. I think the nuclear deal with the US, I think is anything but nuclear. That's how I see it. It's more of a strategic, realignment of India and US, and we use deal as a kind of an expression of it. And I'm very skeptic that whether this nuclear deal would, in the next 20 years, would double our nuclear contribution to energy, even if it reaches 2%, sorry, 2 digits in 2040, I'll be extremely positive. I'm very pessimistic about this nuclear component of the energy.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap up this session. Before we do, though, I want to remind you that you'll be back in this room at 3:30. You have basically from now, with coffee breaks and lunch in between, but from now until 3:30 in your working groups. The working group chairs will then present the work that the groups have done to this point, where they see themselves going in the future. So I will see you back in this room at 3:30 this afternoon. But before we go drink our coffee and smoke our cigarettes, could you please join me in a warm thank you for our great speakers.